Welcome to Photojournalism Now in Conversation. I'm Alison Stuyven-Taylor. In this interview, I'm chatting with Lisette Poole, a Cuban-American photojournalist who's now based in Mexico City. Lisette and I talk about how COVID-19 has impacted the way she works. We also talk about her book, La Paloma y la Ley, The Dove and the Law. Welcome, Lisette, and thanks so much for being part of Photojournalism Now in Conversation.
I'm honored to be here. Thanks.
Lisette, let's start by having a chat about how COVID-19 has impacted your plans.
Yeah, I was very focused on my book promotion, and I had a book tour planned when COVID started. So I had been putting my energy more into that. And then when COVID-19 hit, a lot of things were canceled. Some assignments were canceled. My book tour was canceled. And so I've been getting to know Mexico City on lockdown, which has been interesting. Obviously, there hasn't been a lot of work. I've been able to sell lots of prints and books and things like that. So I've been grateful that I've actually been okay. And, you know, as horrible as the pandemic is and as heartbreaking as it is, I guess for me as a freelancer and someone who's been really on the road for the last several years, I've been taking advantage of just having a break and staying still and trying to work on things from home that I haven't really had time to do for so long. So finding some silver linings, I guess, trying to.
So let's have a chat about your book.
The project is called La Paloma y la Ley. It means the dove and the law. It refers to a spiritual aspect of one of the religion of the women in the book. I was living in Cuba and I started noticing that a lot of Cubans had begun leaving the island through this long route going from either Ecuador or British Guyana and making their way overland to the United States. So they were taking advantage of this policy that was still in place called wet foot, dry foot. And it allowed Cubans sort of an automatic asylum once they touched American soil. So instead of taking rafts through the Florida Straits where they could possibly be lost at sea or get turned back to Cuba, they had started taking this way overland because most of the countries south of Texas would give Cubans a special privilege. So they would give them something called safe passage. So if you were crossing from, say, Guatemala to Mexico, you would turn yourself, as a Cuban person, you would turn yourself into immigration, and they would give you paperwork that would allow you a few days in the country to stay legally as you made your way to the next border. So I met this woman, Marta Amaro. She was in her 50s. We met in 2015. I already knew that I wanted to document this story in some way because so many friends of mine had gone, family members of mine had gone. And I met Marta and she mentioned that she was thinking about doing the trip. So I said, okay, I want to come with you. And she said, okay, sure, fine. Which rarely happens. She would stay in touch with me and I would go visit her on my days off. And we got to know each other over the course of 8 months or so. And then one day she called me and said that she was going the next day to buy her plane tickets and that she was going with her friend Lisette, who I had met just briefly a couple weeks before. Lisette she was 24 at the time, and she's this feisty sort of young, she was a sex worker in Cuba. She lived around the corner from Marta, and they were just friends. They just partied together pretty much, and they got along even though they had a 30-year age gap. So I went the following day with them to buy the plane tickets, contacted some colleagues in the US, and I said, this woman is actually about to leave. Should I go? And, talked it through with people and ultimately felt like I couldn't miss out on the opportunity because I had been wanting to do this for so long. As a Cuban person myself and as the daughter of the Cuban diaspora, I felt compelled to be the person to tell the story and witness it firsthand. So I decided to go. 10 days after buying their tickets, we left on a plane to Georgetown in Guyana. Myself, with Marta and Lisette, and they had no plan. So they had some friends that had done similar journeys or part of the journey. But right before we left, what happened was, because so many Cubans were leaving, I believe it was 56,000 the year that we went, which was 2016, a lot of those borders that I mentioned that were open to Cubans, they had started closing. 2 weeks before we left, Panama closed its border as well. So that changed the trajectory tremendously for them, because instead of taking a little boat around the Darien jungle, they were walking through this really dense rainforest with migrants from all over the world. So that made the journey a lot harder, a lot more grueling in some ways. It ended up, I was on the trip for 51 days altogether. This was just one day after leaving Cuba. They did not know what was in store for them at all. So they're on the flight, they're leaving Havana, and they meet these other Cuban guys who say that they have connections to coyotes or human smugglers. And so when they get off the plane, they meet the same coyotes as their Cuban friends that they've just made on the plane. And they all go together to a motel where the smugglers lay out these different options. They chose to go overland through Guyana and then to Brazil. That picture is them the following morning after having slept on this bus ride, waiting for a call at the border to run to another smuggler's car.
Wow. Okay. That sounds an intense experience. Did you, because you went with them, you were paying the smugglers as well?
I did. Yeah. I debated on that previously and tried to figure out if there would be a way maybe that I could travel legally with my American passport. As you can see, this happened so quickly that I realized very early on there would not be a way for us to stay together if I didn't go every step of the way.
Let's have a talk about a couple of the pictures. So what's happening in this image? Like, where in the journey are we now?
For this picture, we're in Colombia in the northern part, and they're about to cross this expansive gulf that takes about 2 hours to cross. At the time, it was illegal for migrants to cross. So they had to go in these small fishing boats that locals would basically work with the smugglers, and they would be hired out to take migrants across the water secretly. They're leaving at dawn. They're in this sort of rickety fishing boat. I was photographing at the time with my cell phone and a GoPro. I had a bunch of sort of options for cameras because I didn't know what to expect at any moment. So I just kind of photographed with whatever I had handy that seemed to make the most sense. Marta was really nervous. I mean, she, was a little bit older. She felt that she was more vulnerable and fragile. And so she spent a lot of the time feeling very anxious, like the picture in the boat where she's praying. But this is the entrance to the Darien Gap. So they're crossing by water to get to this little town called Capugana. So this photo is from the Darien, from inside the Darien. I took it with film, a small point and shoot film camera that I had as well. And I really wanted to have some film images because I wanted to have some sort of tangible format that took the journey in the same way, that we did, in the same way that Lisette and Marta did. So you can see how intense that rainforest floor is. The terrain is really hard to walk through. It takes migrants anywhere from a few days to a couple weeks to get through. And they'll also cross rivers several times. This image, the women are taking a break. They've crossed rivers that day, and there's the only women traveling in this group of 50 or so migrants and smugglers. In Nicaragua, not having food and water made that part of the journey much more intense, I would say, at least for Lisette. She was really strong. I never saw her in the Darien jungle. She jokes like so much as sneeze, which was sort of true. I have a picture of her putting on her makeup at this encampment on the last day. And she's this very just powerful person. And she really kind of marched through all of her challenges, both in life and on the migration journey. But being in Nicaragua and not having hydration and not having food ended up being really hard for her. So she was having some moments where she was pretty close to passing out. She had to be carried at one point. So that was a really intense moment to watch her go through that and document that. Mexico is a pretty risky country for a lot of migrants, and they had the privilege of being able to fly. So Lisette flew from Tapachula, which is the southern border, to Mexico City, and then she flew from Mexico City to Matamoros, which is the northern border with Brownsville, Texas. So this is another film image of her on the plane, getting ready for her very last leg of the journey. And then on the right are the pictures that she took herself as she was crossing the footbridge to go into the US. She was able to cross the footbridge legally. She had bought herself some high heels and a new dress in Tapachula, and she just sort of waltzed into Customs and Border Patrol and turned herself in. She showed her Cuban passport. She was taken in for a couple of hours in question, and then she was released with something called a parole that allowed her to travel freely within the United States until she got her green card. So before walking into Customs and Border Patrol, she took these photos and she posted them onto Facebook. And I tried to use some social media in the book because Lisette was using Facebook all the time to stay in contact with Cuban friends of hers that now live in the United States, people that had done the journey already, and things like that. And I just think it's a really interesting form of self-expression that so many of us use nowadays, that it felt like without showing the journey in a sense through her eyes or what she saw important in that moment to share with her friends and share with the world, I felt that it would be missing something. So I wanted to make sure to include that as well. Lisette flew from Texas to Chicago and met her boyfriend, Joey, who's the man who paid for her trip. So he lives in Chicago and she's meeting him to be reunited with him. It was July 3rd on this day.
I really love this picture. It says so much to me about, the fact that she's come on this extraordinary journey. She's in that kind of, it almost looks, it's like a dream, this picture, isn't it? It's like, this is the American dream.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to hear you say that. I definitely felt in the moment when it was happening that I couldn't believe that this had, was there. I mean, it made sense considering that 4th of July was coming the next day, but having watched her go through everything that she went through and then having this visual cue to tell, in some ways, the ending of that story or the beginning of the next chapter of her story, I also thought was really special.
And talking about new beginnings, this is Lisette in the US about 2 years after her journey. Is that right?
It's the 4th of July as well. And she is living in Austin, Texas now. She went to Chicago. She was reunited with her boyfriend, Joey, and they broke up not too long after. So she started traveling around the country. She lived in Miami for a while. She was in Portland for a stint. And then she ended up in Austin. She had a new boyfriend and she had a job at this gentleman's club where she's working as a stripper, and she's still working there now.
And so this is Marta back in Cuba visiting the family. So what happened to her? Where did she end up settling?
Yeah, so Marta now lives in New Jersey. She crossed the border 12 days after Lisette. She's been able to pick up odd jobs and pick up a little bit of work. She still struggles financially, but at the end of the day, she's better off than she was in Cuba. And so you can see her in the foreground of this photo with this little boy who's her grandson. And it's her first trip back to Cuba, and she was able to bring enough money to throw a birthday party for all the kids in the neighborhood. So she hired the clown, who you can see in the background. That apartment at the top of the stairs is the apartment that she lived in before She moved away from Cuba, where I got to know her, and she felt really proud to be able to give something to her grandson in this way that she wouldn't have been able to do if she were still living in Cuba. When I made the book, I knew that I didn't want it to be a traditional photo book. I had a lot of information that I was hoping to include. It was important for me to make the book bilingual as well. So when you go through the book, there are maps of each country and our route through the country. There's a map of the whole route. There's information about the places that we are. There are these little notes that I just took for myself that I take when I'm reporting in my phone, basically. And I published some excerpts of those. And then I wrote a bunch of essays. So all the information along with the captions overlaps as you're going through the book. So just making it felt already like a multimedia, I guess, sort of approach to a traditional photography book. And then as I was working on the book, I was talking to California Sunday, the California Sunday magazine. They have a sister publication called Pop-Up Magazine, and it's basically a live performance / podcast that only exists in the theaters where it's happening. So they don't record them, and they do tours every spring and every fall, and they travel all over the United States. Well, they were looking for story ideas, but the first time they ever did a themed tour, the theme was escape. It's already done well beyond what I could have expected.
Thanks so much, Lisette. It's been great chatting with you.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to see the video, and it was great talking with you and meeting you as well.